I'm in eastern Slovakia, and behind me there's a Soviet tank, the iconic T-34. To understand why Slovakia is full with T-34 monuments, we have to go back to 1944. Join me on this little exploration throughout eastern Slovakia and its turbulent history. Just to give you a little bit of context, we're just a few kilometers away from the Ukrainian, Hungarian and Polish border. This very region has always been pretty contested and war-torn, especially during World War I and World War II. But when I said let's go back to 1944, what am I referring to? By the summer of 1944, the tide had turned. Stalingrad, Kursk, Operation Bagration, battle by battle, the Wehrmacht had been pushed back. Soviet forces were now advancing along a broad front, with the Red Army's strategic gaze fixed on Central Europe and the Carpathian passes that guarded it. The Dukla Pass, a historic mountain corridor on the Slovak-Polish border, became a focal point for a specific reason. Inside Czechoslovakia, the Slovak national uprising had broken out in late August 1944. Slovak resistance fighters, partisan units and defecting Slovak army soldiers had seized large parts of central Slovakia and were calling for Allied support. The Soviet High Command launched the East Carpathian Offensive in September 1944, partly to relieve the uprising, partly to force a route through the Carpathians into the Czechoslovak interior. After the victories of the past year, the operation must have looked manageable on paper. The passes would be taken, the uprising relieved, the front pushed forward. But the Wehrmacht, reinforced by Hungarian and Romanian units, had no intention of giving ground easily. The narrow mountain terrain swallowed Soviet numerical advantages whole. What was expected to take days stretched into weeks of brutal attritional combat, some of the bloodiest fighting on the entire Eastern Front. The Soviet plan was quite simple. They wanted to storm the Carpathian Mountains, but they forgot something, and that was that the Germans had erected their so-called Karpatenfestung, the Carpathian fortress. What did that lead to? Well, let me show you. Here you can see the Soviet memorial commemorating the battles that took place here. And this monument, so to say, is just one of so many monuments in this area. The Soviet plan was simple on paper: break through the Carpathian Mountains via the Dukla Pass, link up with the Slovak national uprising, and punch into the heart of German-occupied Czechoslovakia. But that planned 5-day offensive turned into a 50-day massacre. They planned on taking the town of Prešov in just 5 days, but it turned into 50 days at Svidnik that we're going to have a look at too. And the town of Svidnik even became known as the Valley of Death. This tank here is slightly misleading regarding the battles that took place here in fall 1944, because the Soviet Su-100 was introduced in December 1944, so who knows if that type of tank was even used here. And one more. The amount of T-34 tanks around here is amazingly high. What might be noteworthy about the battles that took place here in 1944, the Soviet lost around 13,500 as killed and another 48,000 were wounded. The attached first Czechoslovak Army Corps roughly lost around 1,700 killed and 6,100 wounded. Well, for the Soviets, the Dukla Pass and their planned offensive ended rather disastrously, and it offered way less than expected. But let's continue. And what was with the original goal? To support the Slovak uprising and to secure it? Well, the Slovak uprising had already been crushed by the time the Soviets secured Czechoslovakia. Well, after the disastrous battles at the Dukla Pass, what happened? Czechoslovakia became communist, and from 1949 onwards, the Czechoslovak regime, with the support of the Soviet Union, of course, they erected huge monuments with these T-34 85 tanks, and for this region in eastern Slovakia they became a symbol of the liberation by the Soviet army. But these very monuments would have a darker turn later on. Towards December 1944, the German Wehrmacht, they pretty much hid in these mountains, fortified them to some extent, but then the Soviets gradually pushed them back, which led to quite heavy battles also in that town that I'm currently in. The town is called Davidov. There's once more a memorial dedicated to the Soviet soldiers that fell here on the 16th of December 1944 in this town of Davidov. Such a tragedy. The communists of Czechoslovakia in the late 40s, they built memorials, lots of them, and the doctrine was very clear. The Soviets liberated us, they are our brothers, and basically communism always wins, never fails. So these very memorials that are scattered all over these villages here in eastern Slovakia, they aren't just memorials, they are or were political statements to the might of the Communist Party and the communist system. Well, of course, this was propaganda, but propaganda built on real shed blood during these very bloody battles that took place here in 1944. Ever since the late 40s, these T-34 tanks stood as memorials of the liberation by the Soviets from German occupation, and the inhabitants of Czechoslovakia just accepted that, and they saw it rather as something peaceful. until 1968. In August 1968, people at 2 a.m. awoke to the rumbling of tanks and the announcement of the Czechoslovak radio.
Vážení posluchači, vysíláme zvláštní provolání předsednictva Ústředního výboru Komunistické strany Československa všemu lidu Československé socialistické republiky. Včera, dne 20. srpna 1968, kolem 23. hodiny překročila vojska Sovětského svazu Polské lidové republiky, Německé demokratické republiky, Maďarské lidové republiky a Bulharské lidové republiky státní hranice Československé socialistické republiky. Stalo se tak bez vědomí prezidenta republiky, předsedy Národního shromáždění, předsedy vlády i prvního tajemníka Ústředního výboru Komunistické strany Československa a těchto orgánů. Zachovali klid a nekladli postupujícím vojskům odpor.
This period of the very open socialist way of life, as Dubček had announced it, was officially over. Of course, the tanks used during the Prague Spring weren't these T-34 ones, but rather the T-54 and T-55, but still, it were Soviet tanks, and they were ready to fight against the people. Following 1968, many of the Czechoslovak inhabitants, especially here, saw these monuments as painful reminders to the sudden oppression by Soviet forces. Now, these T-34 monuments even caused some political debates, especially talking about the war in Ukraine. So, what did we just see? Tanks, monuments, memorials to soldiers who died in a war that ended 80 years ago. And I want to be clear. I believe monuments matter. Every fallen soldier, regardless of nation, regardless of which side they fought on, deserves to be remembered, deserves dignity, and deserves a place of honorable rest. That's not political, that's human. The men that died here were real, the battles were real. Dukla, the Prague Uprising, these are not invented history. But here's where it gets complicated. At some of these memorials, I noticed St. George ribbons, a symbol that since 2014 has become explicitly associated with Russian military operations in Ukraine. The Slovak government recently criminalized the desecration of Soviet monuments. That's a political decision, announced to the Russian state news agency TASS. At the same time, other NATO members such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland have been removing Soviet monuments or at least debating it seriously. Slovakia is going in the opposite direction. I'm not here to tell you what should happen to these monuments. That's for the Slovaks to decide. But when the symbols attached to them are the same symbols being used on vehicles invading Ukraine right now, 100 miles from there, that's not history anymore. That's something else. Make of that what you will. If you learned something in this video, please let me know down below in the comments. And I would highly appreciate your like and your subscription to my small channel. Have a wonderful week and see you. Bye. I've never seen so many freaking T-34s in my whole life.